Good morning, folks. Today is Thursday, the 24th of ER. Let's see if I can get this right. The 6th of May. It's May. I've come to terms. And we are learning the whole Shas, one day at a time, one line at a time. And we're presently studying the 4th chapter of Talmud Shabbas, Bemet Toimnin. And yesterday we commenced and concluded an entire Mishnah, a nice achievement. And we spent a good bulk of our time discussing the story of Elisha, the wingman. Reb Bernie Schuster, who's not on presently, sent me an email that he's on some shul in Montreal's email list, and they sent him an email that there's going to be a shir about Elisha's miracle. And Reb Bernie wanted to know if it's possible, this is describing the content of yesterday's shir. And I told him I don't know, because Elisha the prophet also had a miracle or two happen in his career. And so I don't know if Elisha in that shir was going to be about the prophet or about. But anyways, this is an important story, a beautiful story about Jewish oppression, Jewish defiance. We had an opportunity to explore a little bit about the nature of tefillin wearing in that era. And that was the first part of yesterday's discussion. And then in the closing segment, we discussed about the Mishnah made a distinction according to one opinion about it has to be fine, and the Gemara asked what has to be fine. Is it the wood shavings or the flax chaff? And the Gemara asked and answered that it means the fine chaff. And that was yesterday's Gemara. Today we're going to start a brand new Mishnah. It's going to be again in the subject on the topic of Hatmana, insulation, but it's also going to immediately introduce to us the Mishnah, that is going to immediately remind us and reintroduce us to the discussion of muktzah. And as I guess you could imagine, muktzah truly is a very central part of Shabbos observance, the Shabbos experience, the Shabbos conversation. And so we're going to do that. Let's just put a teaser for our shir.
I should have had one where I had a background. That wasn't.
Don't worry, it's a.
I don't know why I'm having this problem. Oh, wow.
All right, so let's start the new Mishnah. Oh, well, while we're loading our page, let's mention our prayers for good news for all of Klal Yisrael, and particularly we're going to mention Yosef and Flora, Jonathan Chaim ben Victoria, Daven Stan Malka, Esther Bas Simcha, Mazel Bas Esther, Michal ben Esther, and I have to add a name, Shlomo Yitzchak ben Rachel. So I'll be blessed with speedy healing and good health and circumstances for all of Klal Yisrael. Reb Bernie Schuster, welcome on. I mentioned your name before you came on about your email. I let everyone know that there's a possibility that we're not the only ones in the world that know the story of Elisha's miracle, although it may actually be referencing the prophet. Also, just to send regards, I just spoke to Saul Zuckerman a few minutes ago. So regards from him. All right, here we go. No, we're not sharing yet. Let's get the screen shared. No, we are sharing this screen. Here we go. 49a. Are you ready?
Ready or not?
Well, actually, Toimnin. One can do Hatmana Shilchin with, Rashi says, Oiros, animal hides, Umetaltal and Oisan, and you may also carry animal hides, skins on Shabbos. Rashi right away says, Bein shetoman behen, bein shaloi toman behen, regardless of if we're describing the very same hides that use for Atman are different hides, you may carry them, the chazu, the mizga alayu, because they have a function that is permissible, and therefore you can use it. Begizet semer, one may also insulate with sheep shearings. I think we might call that wool, or Rabbi Steinsaltz says wool fleece. Ve'ein metaltel and oison. However, they are muksa. Again, you're using them to do hatmana prior to Shabbos, is at the beginning of Shabbos. So you obviously can handle it before Shabbos. However, they remain muksa. Why are they muksa? Well, let me ask you a question. What does a good human being do with raw sheared wool? Any theories? What do you do with it?
Which is a non-Shabbos.
We spin it into, you might comb it, spin it into thread, and use it to weave. All of those are primary categories of prohibited Shabbos activity. So being, just to throw something out there, in general, the malachas of Shabbos can generally be divided into components of of preparing food. Sidur, the pas, it's the way that bread is created, right? So you have to plant and harvest and all the steps in between, and then grind it and turn it into bread and bake it. And we also talk about the process of preparing clothing. And those are not all but two of the very, very prominent and primary prohibited activities on Shabbos. And so therefore, being that all of the conventional, typical uses, short of, oh, see, I'm afraid fix it. Oh, Dr. Hammer, remind me again. What was it called? Fixed functional fixedness.
Yes.
So beyond functional fixedness aside, conventionally shearings of raw, unprocessed wool is to be used for creating thread material, all which are prohibited, and therefore it is muksa. So Ketzad Ha'oiseh. So now the Mishnah says, so let's imagine what's going on over here. You put your cholent or your chicken soup or whatever it is into a box with a lot of shearings around it to keep it nice and hot, and maybe you covered it as well. And you want to access your pot of soup Friday night, and it's covered in shearings of wool, which are muksa. How can you ever open up your pot and have your chicken soup on Shabbos? If it's muksa, you can't handle it. So the Mishnah provides the solution. All you got to do is you pick up the cover, and they fall aside. So don't pick them up with your hands, but you can do activities which will cause them to fall off. Let's read Rashi. If you insulated your pot with these shearings, how can you ever access your pot? Because you're not allowed to handle, to touch, to carry the wool. It's entirely submerged in these wool fleece or the wool shearings. So the explanation the Mishnah says is noitel esakisoy. Rashi explains, take the cover, shel kedera, cover the pot. Sheyesh toras kli aleha, as the cover of the pot is not muksa, it's a kli that you're allowed to handle. Ve'afagav shehein aleha, even though the pot cover is covered with fleece, lo ichbaslan, we are not perturbed by the fact that they are being moved. It doesn't truly become a base to the muksa wool. Why? Because with our relative functional fixedness, we know that the primary purpose of the pot is to cover the, the pot covers to cover the pot. And therefore, that's what its primary function is. It's permissible. And just because it is technically supporting muksa items, it does not become a basis l'davar ha'asur. This Rashi we should probably highlight, because I don't want to go too deep or too far off the track this moment, but it forces us to be a little more creative and a little more imaginative in the concept of basis l'davar ha'asur, to be the base of a muksa item, because it's not absolute. Dr. Hammer, you're muted, but it looks like you're trying to share something, so feel free to unmute yourself, and the same applies to everybody else, of course.
You're going to end up with some wool in your soup, but that's another.
Oh, I knew. I was waiting for someone to ask that, because it's kind of tricky. You're going to end up with matzo balls and wool clumps in your soup. Okay, doctor?
Seems to be a kal v'chomer and a hetev for the money on the bed issue.
You're saying seemingly that should be a heter, but I'll explain to you why it's not. Because in the context of beds, and based on us applying our functional fixedness in those days, unlike today, and I wish we would have had that principle back then when we first talked about it. Back then, a bed had multiple options. And by placing money on it, Erev Shabbos, you're essentially declaring that this is no longer a sleeping bed, this is now a money bed. Whereas when it comes to a pot cover, no amount of stuff piling on top of the pot cover will cause the pot cover to lose its primary function so long as it is acting in its function, covering a pot of soup. And so, sorry, Doctor, go ahead.
But you're making the assumption that it was done intentionally. And I'm saying that realistically, if the money was on the bed or the couch, it just, you didn't do it intentionally. You didn't have the time, you rushed and you didn't do it. So, and therefore, sleeping is important, eating is important. That's your bed, you need a place to sleep. The cover is not muktzar. If there was no intent to put it there.
You're making a good distinction. I believe halacha makes this distinction too. If you truly forgot it, I believe the option would be similar to here. You could pick up the bed cover and it might fall on the floor. You just can't pick the money up when you're dying. So very fair. So this principle is, all the principles that we learn eventually become woven together to construct the applicable and actionable principles of muktzah. And that's why I keep on referring back to the code of Jewish law. I keep on trying to refer back to the code of Jewish law at the end of a discussion, because ultimately, at any given moment as we study the Talmud, which is very essential, we're only getting a snapshot in time and not the totality of the context and the way all of the principles interact. And as we move along, we become more and more wise to the various factors and areas to consider. And so that's what I was pointing out. Shkoyach, Doctor, that is correct. So back to our Mishnah. So we spoke about hides, which are not muktzah because they have a Shabbos dika function. I believe Rashi is saying it could be used as a tablecloth of sorts. Now, in those days, it appears they didn't have tablecloths. They would camp on the floor and spread out some kind of whatever you call it, mat or carpet or rug or whatever. And apparently skins would be, if I understood Rashi correctly, and I'm leaving a small possibility that I didn't understand it correctly. I think the Gemara is going to elaborate. But suffice it to say, hides can be used. Wool shearings, muktzah. However, those wool shearings will not make your pot inaccessible on Shabbos. You would have to take the pot cover, which is not muktzah, and allow the muktzah stuff to fall off without handling them directly. And indeed, Reb Beryl brought up what I was thinking, and I'm sure our Kohen Gadol as well, which is you'd have to be very careful not to have the wool fall into your chicken soup. And it's indeed a concern. But I suppose it was doable. Although I guess we should never fully assume.
How do you explain to your wife that you took her fur coat and wrapped it around the soup bowl?
It's highly unadvisable to take your wife's fur coat and wrap the soup up. It might even be pikuach nefesh.
What's a wife doing with a fur coat in Florida anyway?
You didn't need it anyways. There's always 1 week. There's always like 2 days a year that you need to take out your.
First of all, what are you doing anywhere near the pot? My mother used to say, "Kick me nicht in the tepla."
Right.
All right, let's see the next half of the Mishnah, which is going to elaborate on the principle that our dear doctor alluded to. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah taught kupa. When it comes to a box or a basket, as Rabbi Steinsaltz translates, full of fleece, reading Rabbi Steinsaltz, Rashi, Kishabali to Kedera, Mata Kupa al Tida. He seems to have an alternative solution to this solution. Here the solution was take the pot cover off. Now, by the way, I do have to make an important note. I'm talking about chicken soup, but it's clear from here that we're not exclusively discussing chicken soup. We could be talking other kinds of dishes that maybe are a little easier to handle. So let's see. Kupa muta al tzida v'naita. What you should do is turn the box on its side so as to ensure that the fleece fall off, and then you can take out the pot. So we're going to read the rest of the Mishnah. We're going to read Rashi. We're going to read some analysis. It sounds like he's being a little more stringent when it comes to interacting with the muksa. Why? Shemayital v'eina yachal lachsar. Because Rashi, Shemayital hakidera. It's possible that it'll pick up the pot. V'yiplu hagizin shemikan umikan l'toich guma sheyashu behen. All of the shearings will fall into the hole which was previously holding a pot. And if he wants to return it to its position, he's not allowed to make another furrow, or am I using the wrong word? He's not allowed to burrow into the things to make a new hole. Bear with me a moment because I want to read the entirety of the Mishnah, and then we'll try to figure out what exactly the situation is talking about. So Belazar ben Azariah says, if it's in a box, turn the box on its side, ensure that all of the shearings fall, so you'd be able to restore the pot to its place. The Chachamim Amrim Noitel Machzir. The Chachamim make a comment which is not elaborated in the Mishnah. The Gemara elaborates. The comment the Chachamim say is Noitel Machzir, take it and return it. Now the first question is, you might not always be able to flip the box on its side. For example, if it's chicken soup, I don't suppose that's going to be a very good option. Now, I don't think you're flipping it all the way on its side. You're tilting it to allow the fleece to fall off. Now, what I'm wondering, give me a second. All right, what's evident from the Mishnah is, and again, we haven't fully discussed all the halachas of Atmana, but what's evident from the Mishnah is you would be allowed to restore your pot back into the installation that it was initially placed before Shabbos. If there are any other restrictions or conditions, we'll have to continue seeing through the Gemara. So let's just recap the Mishnah and see where the Gemara takes us. We speak of the ability to use for installation hides, and they're not muksa. We talk about the fact that gizei tzemer, shearings of wool, fleece, is allowed to be used for hatmana for insulation, but it is muksa, which presents a problem. How do you extract your insulated food from the hatmana if you're using this wool shearings? The answer is you can take the cover off and they'll fall on the side. And as far as removing it from the box, tilt the box to allow the shearings to fall out. We are concerned lest you will have a challenge replacing the pot, and you might be interacting with muktzah. I just want to make one note before we go to the Gemara. Rashi explained that our whole Mishnah, including, this part, is discussing the laws of muktzah. There are other commentaries who say this has nothing to do with muktzah, and it's more a commentary on the laws of hatmana with certain restrictions. But we follow Rashi for the purpose of the primarily as our guide in understanding the Gemara. This is the Mishnah. Any more comments before we take a look at the Gemara? Let's take a look at the Gemara, and we're going to again see how the rabbis were socializing, and in the course of their socializing, they discussed many important discussions in the matter of Jewish law. It shouldn't be surprising that their life revolved around Torah, so their discussions in the social settings would also be such. Yosef Rabbi Yonasan ben Achinoi. Rabbi Yonasan, son of Achinoi, Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar, and another Rabbi Yonasan whose father was Elazar, were sitting. The Yosef Rabbi Chanina bar Chama Gabayu, and Rabbi Chanina bar Chama sat along with them. Can you imagine? Okay. And then he asked them, these two rabbis, the following question. He asked them, I was reading the Mishnah Masechet Shabbos, the third Mishnah of chapter 4, and I wasn't certain about the interpretation of the Mishnah. Please help me figure it out. Are we talking about Shlachim Shel Bal HaBayis Tanan? Are we talking about an average Joe's hides in their home? Abel Shel Uman Kivan de Kapid Alayu Lo Metaltalin Lahu. But if you're in a professional manufacturer of hides, they are more meticulous and restrictive about how they're going to use their merchandise, which needs to be sold. And therefore, it is less likely that an Uman will use their schayra, their wares, before selling them. So maybe they should be muktzah. Like Dilma, but maybe our Mishnah is talking about shel uman tanan. Maybe when the Mishnah says that hides are not muktzah, it even includes a professional hide. I don't want to say tanner, but a person that deals in hides, furry. How do you call it? Furry. What do we call a hide for a person that sells furs? Furrier.
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 R-R-I-E-R.
So
The furrier is probably more for furs as opposed to just plain hides that are more leather, I guess.
I'm sorry.
A furrier would probably be more, ones that are actually selling things to be made into fur coats or whatever, versus a hide is more like something would be made into leather to make shoes or
Okay,
whatever.
fair. So here we're being a little bit ambiguous. But I think there's some crossover, because you might put like a leather, you might also put a fur rug or something like that.
Much better job of insulating.
Yeah, so I had a good friend who recently got out of the business. They were in the business for a long time. What does that have to do with anything? I don't know, but if we have any questions, we'll call her up. So the Gemara's question is, in whose world do we say that these skins are not muktzah? An expert or only an average Joe? I hope that's not an insult to say an average Joe. I don't think it's an insult. All right, we said shmatas was an insult, even though we talk much, but maybe. Anyways, okay. Let's see Rashi. Shlachim shel Baal HaBayis Tanan. When our Mishnah commented, that you can carry them. They're not there to be sold. And therefore you're not as anxious, you're not as careful. Because even if they become soiled, you'll just keep on using them for what they're good for, which is as a tablecloth. But again, in those days, not tablecloths, but a mealtime rug or something to that effect. Aval shel umdan, but a professional, a person who does this professionally, and he prepares and fashions these skins and then sells them. He is not going. If your skins that need to be sold are going to become damaged, you're going to not be able to sell them, or you're going to have a considerably lower asking price. Because you would never use them for your table, for your mealtime, therefore they're muktzah. You still could use them for, or maybe you could still use it for atmana, but that is the Gemara's question. So again,
Rabbi, you have an overriding problem here in general.
Yes.
Do we concentrate on the item itself, or the item in the context? Is a hammer in a hardware store different than a hammer in a house? Is a pot different for personal pot, a store that sells pots? It's a whole general question coming up now.
So occasionally, the halacha makes a distinction. And when the halacha makes such a distinction, it's brought up. And so, for example, here where there is a distinction, and this is a general halacha that we're going to become more familiar with now, which is called muksa machmas chesron kis.
I think that the issue here is the intent. It is the professional, consciously or unconsciously, might have a different intent in handling the hides than an average.
Professor, you just made someone very happy.
Havana.
You're correct, but I'm not sure if that's really the underlying issue here. I don't know if it's intent. I mean, of course, intent is a component, but ultimately there is a factual distinction between a consumer and the consumer who's purchased an item and a person who's professionally producing it or selling it. Of course, the intention of a person that sells merchandise is to preserve it in a pristine and easy to sell condition. But broadly speaking in halacha, we occasionally make the distinction and understand that there's a difference between how a buyer treats. For example, until I had kids, I didn't understand why certain people had cars that had dirt and stuff in them. And I was a little bit judgmental. But now that I have kids, I understand that sometimes you're willing to sacrifice a clean car to have relatively calm and well-adjusted kids in the car. So, however, if I was trying to sell a car, I certainly would not be handing super snacks and bamba and juice boxes to kids in the car, because there's a distinction between how you treat your own stuff and how you treat something that you're looking to sell. So certainly there is kavanah involved, but it's not even kavanah. There's a certain default assumption about the distinction between how a professional treats their wares and the buyer uses their wares. Professor, do you agree, or do you still?
Yeah.
But tell me, have we successfully? Is kavanah intent removed from the conversation, or it's just there's an assumed intent?
No, I just thought it was a part of consideration when we consider differences between a professional and a consumer.
So I don't want to totally rule it out. Maybe in my own.
Use the term unconsciously.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So basically, there is an unconscious, a subconscious or a semi-conscious intention about how a person in business treats their stuff, and halacha just about assumes and supposes that there is that distinction, and therefore the halacha in this case is at least being proposed to possibly distinguish between the two, and that's essentially the question that Chanina Bar Chama is asking the two Rabbi Yona's sons. Do we make this distinction between the end user and the seller or not? So let's take some votes. What do you think? Does the halacha make this distinction or not? Any theories? Any thoughts? Anybody?
Well, like you say, if you're a professional, like you were saying, you're more likely to have to be doing something non-Shabbos-stick with it versus just the end user.
But here we're not even talking about not Shabbos or non-Shabbos. The question is, will you use it at all? And the assumption here is that a salesman is not going to go into his warehouse, take his chayra, and use it in a way that's going to diminish its value. And therefore, you're not going to use it functionally. And therefore, there's no use for it on Shabbos. And if there's no use for it on Shabbos, then it's muksa. So I know there's a few steps involved. Basically, if you're not going to use it for any function, it's going to stay in your warehouse, well, then it's off limits. I believe here we might classify this as, I'm gonna hold off for now and saying the exact classification. Yeah. All right, let's see the answer. Amar Lahu Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar. Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar responds to the questioner, Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama, and says as follows: Mistabra, it's reasonable to suppose Shal Bal Habayis Tanan, that this Mishnah is exclusively talking about the end user, the homeowner. Aval Shal Uman Kopid Alayhu. But it is certainly the case that a person who is a craftsman who needs to sell the merchandise is going to be particular not to let it be used before selling it. Therefore, in a craftsman, the manufacturer or the salesman, it would be Moshe. That is the assumption being made by Rabbi Yonasan. Amar lahu Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama. So Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama added, Kach Amar Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosi. Thus said Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosi. Abba Shalcha Hava. We're turning the page to 49. The Abba Shalcha Hava. My father was a professional tanner. The Omar Heviu Shlachim Eneshav Aleihen. And he would use his chayra to sit on them, indicating, as Rabbi Steinsaltz points out, In other words, even the hides of a craftsman can be used on Shabbos. Very interesting. You want to see what Rashi says? Rashi disagrees with Rabbi. Okay, let me show you something. It's a very small difference, but it's interesting. Let's look at what Rashi says, and then we'll see what Rabbeinu Hananel says in Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation. Here, this is a story. Rabbi Yishmael said, my father, which I'm assuming is Rabbi Yossi, Shal Chahava, was a professional tanner, He was in the trade, in the business. The Omar, and he said, bring some hides and we'll sit on them. When did he say to bring the hides? Did he say it on Shabbos or did he say in the weekday? And is there a difference? So let's look at Rashi. The Omar, and he once said, can anyone read the word that my cursor is going over?
Oh,
So he once in the weekday said.
Rabbi, it doesn't make sense, Rabbi. With all due respect.
Why not? Let's hear.
Why would we even discuss it? During the weekday, he can do whatever he wants. Hang from
That's my question, and you're going to love the answer. So Rebbeinu very well articulated very clearly my question. Why is Rashi telling us that the story the Gemara is bringing to prove our position on the status of muksa for hides on a weekday? Why don't we just say that it was on Shabbos? And indeed, because of Rebberu's question, Rabbi Steinsaltz rejects Rashi's interpretation and embraces Rabbeinu Hananel's interpretation. Rabbeinu Hananel was a even earlier commentary from the time of the Gaonim, in the Gaonic period. He may have lived 100, 200 years before Rashi. Really one of the earliest commentaries that's actually printed in many Talmuds. And he is quoted by Rabbi Steinsaltz.
Now keep in mind, if a professional will sit on the hides during the week, it's showing them that they're not so, paranoid about the.
Okay. So Mark just gave what I understand the answer to be. The answer is as elementary as the question, but we needed to go through this process. Without the question, we wouldn't appreciate it. But now that we had the question, we can see the answer. We are not talking laws of Shabbos. We're trying to get into the mind of the average craftsman. We're trying to get into the subconscious or the half-conscious intentions of a craftsman. And so according to Rashi, we bring an instance, a weekday instance. He didn't have to start thinking, oh, the laws of Shabbos, is it muksa, is it not muksa? On a very natural time where there would be no reason for him to have a second thought. He comfortably and confidently said, go to the warehouse, bring us a hide, we'll sit on it, and there's no problem. And so Rashi says from this story, we can infer that if on a weekday, you don't think twice about using your wares, it means that there is a function that's available to the owner, to the manufacturer, to the tanner, and therefore on Shabbos too, it should not be muksa. And so it's possible that Rabbeinu Hananel, his pshat maybe reads, and Rabbi Steinsaltz's pshat reads more easily, but I think Rashi is digging a little deeper and saying we're not talking about laws of Shabbos, we're trying to get into the mind of the tanner. We're trying to get into the mind of the professional. And the best time to do it is when there are no other considerations, and that would be during the week. I'm open to anyone that might disagree with me, but I think this is the reason why Rashi goes that route, and I find it very fascinating. Any thoughts?
Is it possible, Rabbi, that there's a differentiation as we had with candlesticks and trays, that there's a difference between sitting on something and moving something on Shabbos?
There may be, but that's not what we're saying here. Here the question is there a permitted use? It is permitted. So let me revise what I said. These skins weren't just used as tablecloths. They were used as chairs or benches or seats, right? You'd have a stack of
right.
We can imagine you're sitting on your earthen floor and it's mealtime, and so you invite all the guests, you throw out all the sheepskins or whatever, and you sit on them, and that's how you have the meal. That is a permissible use. If these hides have a permissible use and they shouldn't be muktzah, especially if it's a primary function. However, if there's no use because you're very anxious about what's going to happen to your wares, to your schayra, then it would be muktzah. So here we're not distinguishing between sitting and transporting, leaning or transporting. We're simply distinguishing between if there's a function or if there is not a function.
Rabbi, the Gemara doesn't tell us if it was Shabbos whether the son went and did it. What
You're
would
right,
happen
the
if
Gemara
you
doesn't
say,
say.
I don't agree, I won't move it. What rules?
Basically, let me add one more thing. The machlokes of Rabbeinu Hananel and Rashi is a machlokes of if the story is absolutely a defining proof. According to Rabbeinu Hananel, this is absolutely proof that the great Rabbi Yossi askined that these hides are not muksa. According to Rashi, this is not a psak. This is not a maser rab. We don't have a precedent of Rabbi Yossi treating hides as non-muksa, but we have an insight into his thinking, which we should be able to infer to mean that it's not muksa. So Rashi, and I think it's not only Rashi, it's Rashi and other commentaries say that it's just an inference of how craftsmen treat their furs. Now I know someone else is going to say, hold on, who says that all craftsmen and salespeople are monolithic? Maybe some salespeople, and this would reopen the professor's suggestion that it goes back to Kavanah. Maybe some salespeople, maybe some people in the business are more anxious to use their schayra. Others are less anxious to use their schayra.
Maybe they have fancy merchandise and plain merchandise.
Maybe it depends on the quality and the tier and the price. Maybe it depends on if you are the guy who's processing the hides versus the person that actually has to market them. There are many, many variables, but and it reopens the question. But yet, at the point of our question here, it's clear that we're looking at the average craftsman in a monolithic sense. There is the general assumption of how they act.
Where are we going to get that?
Tosfos, here's Tosfos, which actually conveys to us Rabbeinu Hananel's pshat. So let's take a look at it. Pirush Rabbeinu Hananel. The Omar Heviu Lishlochem b'Shabbos. He instructed that they bring it on Shabbos. V'halacha Rabbi Yossi. And of course, the halacha is going to follow Rabbi Yossi, the kaimal on Maaseh Rav, because we know that a story of the practice of our great Chachamim has a very strong weight in determining the halacha l'maaseh, how we should act. V'chein Nira and Tosfos says, I want to sign off on Rabbeinu Hananel's pshat, which is very much in contrast to Rashi. The Ibachol Mairi, because here's Tosfos again. If we're talking about weekday, as Rashi says, and by the way, Reb Beryl Schuster clearly is taking the side of this Tosfos, right?
It seems that way. It's a good company to be in.
Exactly. The Ibachol Mairi, if we're talking about weekday Kiddush Pirush HaKuntras, like Rashi says, V'loi Maisi Raya Ela De'um and Ami Lekaped. All we've done is brought proof that sometimes a professional is less makpid. Then this should have been brought later on in a discussion again when we're trying to understand experts. And therefore, Tosfos, Rabbeinu Hananel are inclined to say that this was a psak halacha. I have a feeling, I haven't done this in depth yet. I have a feeling that in the halachic conversations, there's probably a big distinction if you follow Rashi or if you follow Tosfos. If you follow Tosfos, we would certainly say that all hides are not muksa. Whereas if you follow Rashi, it's not all that certain. Now I just need 10 seconds, excuse me. Excuse me. And actually, I want to do one more thing belatedly before we continue. Bear with me a moment. Yesterday, was Sharon Schmier's father's yahrzeit. Sharon was, and I think is still an honorary member of our Chabura. So I just want to mention her father's name. Beryl Schuster, you know her father's name? Do you remember it? Yosef Ben Beryl, do you remember? Beryl, you remember Sharon's? All right, we'll remember today. Yosef Shmir, whose yahrzeit again was yesterday. Now we can continue. Meisvei. Are you ready to continue? It's too quiet. All right. Meisvei, the Gemara challenges this assertion. What assertion? That professionals too are entirely comfortable using their merchandise. Wooden boards that belong to the homeowner, you're allowed to carry them. Nisarim, Mishal Oman, but if it belongs to a professional, belongs to Home Depot, a metaltal and oisan, you're not allowed to carry them on Shabbos. Mm-hmm. Why? Because again, I don't know quite the function on Shabbos, but apparently there is a permissible function for a regular person. But if it's in the warehouse, don't carry them. Shema yiskalkalu, because the owner, the salesperson, is concerned that they'll become damaged. However, if the professional, the person selling them, had in mind prior to Shabbos, to use them as a serving dish, then it is always not muktzah, you can carry it. And therefore, what do we see here? That the default assumption is that a professional, a salesperson, a manufacturer will refuse to use their schoira, their wares, for a personal use, and therefore it should be muktzah. The only time that a professional would be allowed to use it is if he had a contrary kavana before the onset of Shabbos. By the way, by reading the rest of the text, we now have a concept of what you might use a piece of wood for. You might use it as a cutting board, or to present as a platter. And by the way, today, what's it called? Those boards that are very, very popular? Come on, you know what I'm talking about. I don't know how to pronounce it. Charcuterie. You know what I'm talking about? There's a big craze in the world today.
You also have the board for an extension table.
Or for your table. I don't know how to pronounce it. Charcuterie. Yeah, it's these.
That's French. That's French for delicatessen.
Oh yeah, but today in America it became a big craze apparently. I guess a deli board or a sampler. So, anyways, we use these boards.
It's called charcuterie.
Charcuterie, right.
Sorry, I have Mikey here.
Why is charcuterie so popular all of a sudden? What happened? Any theories? Mark, we need your insight. All right.
It's just a meat board.
It's a meat board.
It's like a board filled with like different kind of meats.
A board filled with many different types of meats.
Right. So being that that's very popular, it's obvious that one might use a board for that on Shabbos, and therefore it's not muktzah. But if you're in the business, if you're selling them, then you would have to have a explicit kavana to use it. Otherwise, it is muktzah. This is a strong challenge to the assertion of Rabbi Yossi. Now, I have an interesting question for you. No. Chanina Bar Chama is the person who asked the original question, correct? He asked the Pshat in the Mishnah. And then he himself told the story of Rabbi Yishmael bar Rabbi Yossi. So if he knew the story, why did he have the question? You hear my question here? If this story is so conclusive, the story should have provided the answer. Why did he have a question? You understand? Give me a thumbs up if you understand what I'm asking, because maybe it's not a good question. If Chanina Bar Chama had the key to the answer, he had the anecdote which proves and validates the answer. Well, why didn't he mention it at the beginning? Possibly that would explain Rashi, why Rashi says that it's only a supporting insight into the psychology of an uman and not a halachic, not a ma'aser Rav. According to Rabbi Hananel, this story gives the conclusive psak. Well, then why did Rabbi Hanina have the question? According to Rashi, this story is a good anecdote. It does give us some insight into the mind of the uman, but it's not a halachic. It's not a story that gives the halachic perspective. So according to Rashi, my question is a support to why Rashi would explain the Gemara. Explain the story of the skin, the tanner, using his own merchandise to be in the weekday. If you got it, good. If not, just forget about it. But
They could always rent it. They could always be rented.
Yeah. So now the Gemara asks the question: why do you say that a salesperson is comfortable using their schayra? We have another brisa which clearly indicates that salespeople do not use their merchandise. So the Gemara says, Shani nisarim the kapid alayu. There is something distinctly vulnerable about wooden boards. You smash into the board and you make a dent or some wood flake chips off, it's done. You can't resell it. But a hide, you spill a little chicken soup on it, you wipe it up, and no one knows the difference. So it seems like the wood is much more vulnerable. So now, based on this answer, which is, again, we're not at the end of this discussion, but at this very point, we would say as follows: do craftsmen use their merchandise? Question. Now, what would be our answer at this point in the Gemara? It depends. If the merchandise can be easily brought back to, what do you call it? If you could bring the merchandise back to original condition, well, then maybe a craftsman is less concerned about using it. But if it's very vulnerable and if it'll be evident that it was used, it gets worn in, well, then maybe you'd be less inclined. So I'd say, let's say a person that has a shoe store would probably not want his kids stomping around in his shoes because eventually the shoe molds to the foot, and therefore it becomes evident that it was used. But other items, less so.
But you could technically you could have items that are improved by being used.
That's true, but if you're a consumer,
if you're a baseball player, you know that you have to work in a mitt.
Yeah, but if you're a consumer and you're going to a store and buying a new product, you don't want someone else to work in your mitt. You'll do it yourself.
There are exceptions. There's exceptions.
By the way, there's a big industry. We had a few people in our community. They're no longer here. But for 1 year, we had a couple actually living in the La Mer. What was their business? Their business was taking all of the returns that were sent back to Walmart and to the other stores. And if you send a return item, it doesn't go back to Walmart.
It's a huge business.
It's a huge business, but the original store can't sell that under their original label, because when you're buying something from the store, there's a chazaka that it's brand new, at least certain stores. And so just the fact that something was used once or twice and returned, it already becomes diminished in value. And therefore, a salesperson doesn't want somebody using their stuff even once or twice. So again, the distinction at this point is hides, no one will ever know. So the salesperson is less concerned. Wood, at least these kind of unfinished wood, it will be evident if it was used, and therefore you cannot do it. That's
called refurbished.
Refurbished, yeah. Tashima. The Gemara is now going to try to further explore the law of muksa as it pertains to professional hides, a tanner's hides. Tashima. Oirais, skins, hides, bein avudim, bein shein avudim. Whether they were tanned or whether they were not tanned, mutter l'taltalam b'Shabbos. you can carry them on Shabbos. They are not muktzah. Like Amru Avudim. So now the distinction between tanned and not tanned is really irrelevant for the laws of Shabbos. It is relevant to the laws of susceptibility for Tumah, for impurity. Rashi. The whole reason why we talk about tanned or not tanned is only for the laws of impurity. My love, what do we mean here? Aren't we saying aren't we essentially saying there's no difference if the hide is in the possession of an owner or the craftsman or the tanner, because the owner is typically going to use a processed hide, right? And a professional is going to have it whether it's processed or not processed. So maybe here maybe this text is telling us that hides are never muktzah, even if it belongs to a craftsman, which would prove again the halacha of what's the deal with hides. The Gemara answers loy shel bal habayis. This whole conversation that you're allowed to carry hides, whether they're processed or not, is only talking about the end user. Aval shel uman mai. What would be the halacha regarding a craftsman? Ein metatlin. You should not be allowed to carry. So again, our Gemara is continuing to try to delve into the halacha as it pertains to a professional in the warehouse. Can you use the hide? I'm sorry, the hide muktzah or not? And so now at this point, our Gemara says maybe the craftsman,
gained 5 pounds.
The salesman cannot carry it on Shabbos. So Gemara says, if that's the case, take a look. Our Mishnah, our Raisa says, we only distinguish for purity and impurity. Why does the Mishnah not distinguish between if it's a balabayis or a salesperson, a craftsman? Let the Mishnah say, the law that skins are never muktzah is only if it's of the homeowner, the end user. But when it comes to a professional, it is muktzah. You understand the question? We have a braita that says that skins are never muktzah. And then it says, you know what we're talking about? For the laws of purity, we distinguish between processed and not processed hide, tanned or not tanned. Now that our Mishnah, or now that our Brisa is getting all specific, why doesn't the Brisa explicitly state that we're talking about home-owned hides, the end user's hides, and not the craftsman or the salesperson? So the Mishnah, the Gemara answer is simple. Kula b'balabayis kumari. It's utterly obvious from the context of the Brisa that all it's talking about is the homeowner. Now the Gemara ends up with a final comment, and then we're going to call it a day. Kitanoi. In a sense, we are left with two possible understandings about the laws of a craftsman. We have strong evidence that a craftsman should be entirely muktzah. On the other hand, it seems plausible that maybe they would be able to handle their hide, even on Shabbos, because they would use it. And we now say this is a machlokes in a Tanaic machlokes. This is a machlokes that goes back to the era of the Mishnah. What's the machlokes? And this is going to close out this subject. One opinion says the hides of the end user are not muktzah, but the hides of the salesperson, the craftsman, the tanner, are muktzah. Rabbi Yossi disagrees and says Rabbi Yossi, the same Rabbi Yossi who was a tanner and was comfortable using his own merchandise, he says that whether you're an end user or a salesperson, hides are not muktzah. So let me just give a fast recap over here. Our Gemara asked the question, what's the deal with hides? If it belongs to a craftsman, is it muktzah or not? We thought we had proof that it is. We thought we had proof that it isn't. In the end of the day, it turns out there's a machlokes. in the era of the Mishnah, there was a Mishnaic machlokes. One opinion says it is muksa because a good craftsman who's going to sell his merchandise doesn't touch it. But we have Rabbi Yossi, and he says, no, I have a good authority that occasionally a craftsman, a salesperson would take something from the warehouse, and as long as you can bring it back up to look like new, well then a person is not going to be concerned about handling it. So that's, in a nutshell, today's Gemara. We have a potential distinction between what a end user is comfortable with to do with their item and what a professional who's selling would do with it. And if a professional would not handle their merchandise, then it's muksa machmas chesron kis. It's muksa because you're afraid that it's going to diminish in value and therefore you don't touch it. That's today's Gemara. Comments, questions, thoughts? Doctor, go ahead.
If I may, just something to put on our long list for the future, which your example of the Walmart repackaging,
yes,
got me to think of whether or not there's any moral or religious issue involved with particularly clay kodesh, selling clay kodesh, whether it's tefillin or a becha or silver stuff, or
you mean second-hand clay kodesh?
Yes, it depends how you're going to define second hand. Someone bought the left and they 2 days later they said, "Oh, my daughter-in-law doesn't like it. Here, take it back." Is that, I mean, or tefillin?
Oh, I hear you. You're saying, can you return?
Not can you return? Can the merchant just put it back on the shelf and sell it as though it's new?
That's an interesting question. That's certainly something that we'd have to put on the long list. But I'll give you an instance. I have a new family on the ocean. We put up mezuzahs, and the husband told me that, he has his tefillin up in his northern home, and we discussed that it would be very wonderful if he would have a pair of tefillin in his Florida home. And I advised that if they'd be interested, I could assist them in purchasing a beautiful pair of tefillin, and they asked me to do so. And so I reached out to a friend who is in the wholesale business of tefillin and mezuzahs. I told him, listen, get me a very nice pair of tefillin, give me a good deal. And I said, listen, let me take the pair of tefillin, and no one's going to wear them, but I'm going to show them to this person, and as long as he's willing to take it, I'll pay you. But then, of course, this person kept on having, unfortunately, doctor's appointments and this and that, so we haven't yet seen them. At a certain point, I said, you know what, let me just pay you for the tefillin. Either this guy will take them, or I'll find another customer, but it's not fair for me to hold on to your schayra, and then you'll have to, So it's an interesting question, and it's a relevant and real question. So I'm glad you brought it up. But again, the answer is a little more complicated. In the 30 seconds of overtime that we're going to embark upon, I just want to share with you that in the Code of Jewish Law, there is an entire section that discusses different kinds of items that can and cannot be handled. And the Shulchan Aruch, I'm opening now the Shulchan Aruch Harav, explicitly mentions hides, whether it's tanned or not tanned, they're not muksa, because you could use them to sit and the like, and therefore it's considered a vessel, a kli. And then he says whether it belongs to a end user or the person that does the tanning, who's going to sell them, because apparently salespeople are less concerned about using this type of merchandise. When do you say, then he says, when do we say that a salesperson, a craftsman will handle it? When they're already settled and dry and ready. They're ready, market ready. But if they're still in the middle of the process, then really no one would ever use them. And then of course, they are muksa. Then he goes on to saying, what about wood? Wood that belongs to a balabayas, the end user, not muksa. But for an expert, for a professional, it is muksa, because you certainly are concerned about it becoming damaged. And therefore they are muksa, machmas, what I've told you, chesron and kis. It's muksa because you're concerned about the loss that will be incurred. Because as Reb Beryl Schuster told us, there's a big difference in price, what you can fetch for a new item and for a second-hand item. And then it says, like what our Gemara says, if you had in mind explicitly to use it, then you could use it. It's not Musa. So our Gemara that we study today is very, very relevant, and it's actually quoted in Shulchan Aruch Halacha LeMaisa. I want to thank everyone for joining us today in our another excursion through the Talmud. Hashem's help, I hope we'll be able to join together tomorrow in good health. Continue our journey through the entire Talmud.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach, Rabbi.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you all.